We now go across the aisle to hear the view from congressional Republicans. Julia spoke with Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, a Republican from New York and vice chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus, which aims to foster bipartisan solutions to tough issues. Take a listen.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us here today. I just want to introduce you, I think, a little to our audience. You're the vice chair of the House Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a bipartisan group of members of Congress organized to get to yes to help solve some of our country's most pressing challenges. Just to start off with, what lessons have you learned by reaching across the aisle on these tough issues?
Well, we're in a very polarizing period in our nation's history, and unfortunately, a lot of times things that you don't think are controversial somehow become controversial.
Yeah.
I remember I was one of 13 Republicans who worked with Democrats to pass our infrastructure law during my first term. And this was critical because the funding from this infrastructure package, particularly for an aging city like New York that I represent, where we have needs for roads, bridges, our ferry system, our sewer system is very outdated, and many other things, maritime industry that supports so many jobs. This was critical, but yet somehow after this bill was passed, we got death threats for voting for roads and bridges. Like, who thought that was going to be controversial? I think it's a lot of it is explaining and making sure people understand what's really in these pieces of legislation. Sometimes there are just people who are out there giving misinformation of what the bill does, what it funds, what it could be used for, and making sure that we inform our constituents about these things. I think is a real key. Making sure that people understand facts, both lawmakers who are voting on these pieces of legislation, and the American people who are paying. Right, they're the taxpayers. They deserve transparency. They deserve to know. I think that where we can, we find common ground. It's very unfortunate that so many things have become difficult because there's pressure from the far left or the far right to not solve some of our nation's problems. But I think for the most part, we can find common ground. And yes, it's true that we want to take the country perhaps in different directions. I mean, we're very focused on border security, on public safety in our streets, on reducing inflation, those pocketbook economic issues, right? Being able to afford to put gas in your car and food on your table. Where our colleagues may have different priorities, but where we can find common ground, we should really try to come together. And when we disagree, we hold the other side accountable. That's the way it should be working in a debate. We do it in the media, on the floor, but not to attack people personally, but to do it in a respectful manner based on policy.
And you brought up that partisan environment we see obviously on Capitol Hill, but quite frankly, across the country. And we've seen that a lot of young voters in particular, we see that they're, fired up to an extent, but there seems to be this trepidation, this nervousness, and also just sort of this negative feeling about the idea of getting involved in politics, whether it is running for office or voting or organizing, canvassing, etc. What would you tell young voters in your district, or young voters just in general about, how would you convince them or encourage them to become more involved in the public service and political space?
Well, look, I think that it's important to remember that, you get the government that you vote for, right? If people want to see changes, if they want to see accountability where there isn't any, it's up to them to hold elected officials accountable. And then, you know what, if they don't like somebody, they should replace them. But they should be holding elected officials accountable. And that starts by engaging and knowing how your representative is voting. It's a representative can come to you and say they support the police, and next thing you know, they voted to defund $1 billion from the NYPD. So you have to match what they're saying with how they're actually voting on these really important issues. So that would be my number one thing. Number two is, I got involved at a very young age. I was a high school student. I was a junior in high school. The reason why I got involved was because my mother fled a communist country. She fled Cuba. She's very passionate about being able to elect our leaders. And that really motivated me and got me involved in, the future. Really, we are the ones that are going to determine the future of this country. I mean, do we want to make sure our freedoms, our liberties are preserved? Do we want to go down a path of socialism like we've seen in Central South America, even some countries in Europe? Many of them have had to reverse course because they were not happy on the path that they were on. But the bottom line is, Plato used to say that, the apathetic people who are the thing about being apathetic to politics is that you end up being ruled by evil people. That was the sentiment. I'm paraphrasing, of course. But that's the truth. When you don't vote, you're not politically active, you're not engaged, you don't know what your representatives are doing, then you are affected. And I think the other thing is that young people know that they are affected, right? They're going to put gas in their car. They're paying $20 more today to fill up their tank than they were 4 years ago. Their interests on their credit card bills are the highest they've been in 2 decades. They're looking to start a family and buy a home. They can't with the mortgage rates this high. It's just completely restrictive and unaffordable. So, they may be concerned about public safety. That's a big issue in my district. They have to see what policies led to safety declining and then not vote for those people who put in place those policies.
Right, right. And, I want to zero in particularly on young Republican voters. I mean, I think there's a lot of data going back decades that would suggest that young voters tend to vote more liberal, but sometimes as they get older, then they start to maybe come back to the center, maybe vote a bit more conservatively. But, with young Republicans in particular, in reaching young Republicans, how is, how is a member, a lawmaker, someone who is involved with campaigns, how do you reach them? Because I get the sense that, we hear young liberal voters, progressives, they're much louder in the online space. And I don't say that in a disparaging way. It just seems like they're a louder voice. But how do you reach young Republicans and bring them into the fold?
I think you got to meet people where they are, right? And that means engaging them. There's a lot of young Republican clubs, there's college Republican clubs, going to where they may be, whether that be a sporting event or a concert in the district. Sometimes there's a lot of different, walks that raise money for different charities that you'll see a lot of young people participating with their schools, with their families. So trying to engage them, I'm big on animal rights issues. That's an issue that young people really care about, right? And so I'm involved with a lot of my local rescue groups, and that has, been a great opportunity to meet more young people. Working with my local colleges, we've been able to deliver a significant amount of federal funding for our local colleges and giving children and young people opportunities. I think that that's what this is really all about, bringing, going to like sporting events. We have something where we do a basketball clinic. Things like that, I think, are great ways to engage young people and to hear what they're thinking, what their thoughts are. I try to do it as often as possible because I think it is important to get an idea of what their issues of concern are. And they're concerned with the environment. And we do beach cleanups in my district as well. It's some way that we can engage people. But at the same time, they're concerned about affordability, right? They want to be able to go out with their friends and to travel, and they're seeing, airfares are so high, you can't fill your gas tank. It's becoming too expensive to do things that you would love to do with your friends. Even going out to dinner or drinks has become something that you have to save for the weekends to do, right? So I think talking to them about why everything's so expensive right now. Don't they want more access to things that they can afford? And I think that that's where these discussions about what is truly driving up the cost of everything. Well, it's partly an anti-energy agenda. So that's number one. It also is a lot of spending that has put pressure on the dollar, spending by government that's put pressure on the dollar. They have to understand, I think, those dynamics. And I think a large part of them do. I think the thing is that, like every American, when you turn your lights on, you just want the lights to come on, right? You never think about the process of how it gets there. But I think it's sort of the same thing with legislation and policy, and some of these issues that you're impacted with each and every day.
You know, what's so interesting about your response is that you talked so much about in-person meetups, meeting voters in person and having that face-to-face contact. And, oftentimes I think when we talk about young voters, people automatically think social media, whether it's,
Yeah.
TikTok, Instagram Reels, X, et cetera, the list goes on. Do you think maybe we're putting a bit too much stock in social media for getting these voters engaged? Is it broader than that?
Well, I think social media is really important,
Right,
but
right.
unless you're somebody who unfortunately is controversial in government, right? You don't necessarily have that type of following that some of the other members who will say outlandish things or, say things just to get attention and clicks, and retweets. And, that's not really my style. My
Yeah.
style is kind of trying to be a little more of a centrist, trying to really try to govern. But yes, talking about issues that people care about, right?
Mhm.
Affordability, animal rights, access to education, crime and public safety. These are the things that young people talk to me about. But yeah, I use my social media. It's a great tool. It's a great way to get out there. But if you don't have the followers, like some of the bigger names that are controversial and actually end up are the ones who are most extreme, then you really don't have that type of following to get that message out as effectively.
Absolutely. It's all that those forms of communication very important. Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.